Hola, estudiantes! Let's do a guided reading together in Spanish, where I'll show you some different strategies for reading in Spanish and understanding different texts that we'll encounter in this class. This text is going to be about America Latina, or Latin America, which are these countries, many of them that speak Spanish. And so as we read about this text, we can see also that it has been adapted from Wikipedia. This gives us a little bit of background information. We know that Wikipedia texts are, general information, just kind of going over the surface level, general background information of a topic, which can be really important, especially as we learn more about Latin America and its connection to the Spanish language as we learn the Spanish language. So the first thing that I do when I read these texts is that I just read them all the way through, and I'm going to read this one out loud. And you can just listen and follow along, and you'll be very surprised at how much you can understand, even if you don't have any experience reading in the Spanish language. Just take one moment to listen and catch what you can, some of the main points of this text. I begin. La cultura de América Latina es una mezcla de música, bailes, comida, arte local y tradiciones variadas. En América Latina hay sitios donde las influencias de culturas indígenas, España, Francia, África y Portugal son fuertes. La riqueza cultural viene de muchas partes. Las culturas antiguas, como los aztecas, mayas y incas, tienen mucha influencia en países como Guatemala, Ecuador, Perú, Bolivia, Honduras y México. La historia de colonización por España, Francia y Portugal marcó mucho la literatura, la pintura y la música en países como Chile, Argentina, Colombia, Uruguay, Venezuela y Brasil. También la religión cristiana fue muy importante. La influencia africana es fuerte en países como Brasil, Cuba, Colombia, Haití, Panamá, Ecuador, República Dominicana y Venezuela debido a la llegada de esclavos africanos. En 19 países latinoamericanos hay unos 200 millones de personas descendientes de africanos y comparten una identidad cultural llamada afrolatinidad. Las personas de Italia, Alemania y Europa migraron y cambiaron la cultura en Argentina, Uruguay, Brasil, Chile y Venezuela. También la llegada de chinos, coreanos y japoneses influyó en la cultura de Brasil, Cuba, Guatemala, Panamá, Perú y República Dominicana. La mezcla de todas estas influencias ha creado una cultura diversa en América Latina, llamada a veces cultura indígena afro-latinoamericana. La cultura en esta región es única y llena de tradiciones, arte y formas de expresión. Great! So you start to think then, what did you catch from this text? What were some of the main points? And you probably were able to catch that a lot of this had to do with culture and many of the different countries and people that influenced Latin American culture throughout history. And we can begin by now breaking the text down paragraph by paragraph. And what I like to do is look at each paragraph and just try to get what the main point of each one is. And you look at the beginning paragraph here as it introduces America Latina, and it says it's a mezcla de música, bailes, comida, arte local y tradiciones variadas. So there you can probably catch some of the words like music, comida or food, and art and traditions. So those are some key words that let you know what this text is all about. From there you can start to pull out different phrases and words that you don't understand, and it might be helpful to know what they mean in English or try to figure them out on your own. For example, here it says, es una mezcla de música, bailes, comida. And that's a tricky one to figure out. Maybe it might help you to look it up. And for that, I might suggest using a translator. For example, you might use Google Translate, where you can type in a phrase, una mezcla de, and it means a mix of. You can even then hear how it's pronounced by clicking this listen button. And so that's one tool that you can use to help you translate some things that you don't know. after you catch some of the words and translate them, I recommend adding them to a Quizlet list of flashcards, or you can make flashcards on your own pieces of paper. But Quizlet is free, and you can create sets of flashcards. Here I put una mezcla de as the term, and then the definition is a mixture of in English. So I have Spanish and then English there. I even included a little picture of some mixed nuts, and that can remind me that this means mixture or a mixture of. And that's one way to start your vocabulary learning list in this class. And so back to the text, right? So we can see then, okay, la cultura de América Latina es una mezcla de, or a mixture of music, dances, food, local art, and traditions, various traditions. En América Latina hay sitios donde las influencias de culturas indígenas, España, Francia, África y Portugal son fuertes. So there it's talking about different countries and different people that have influenced the Latin American culture. And so here's some pretty good keywords that you can find, like hay sitios, or hay, which means like there are, or there are places. And then new words that you might be finding, like culturas indígenas. You can look that up. That means indigenous cultures. I recommend using another tool called Word Reference. You can go to wordreference.com, and this is where you can type in different words and phrases and get the translation. Here I typed in indígena. You can listen to it. What's cool, you can listen to it in accents like from Mexico, España, Spain, or Argentina, Argentina. You can also see not just translations, but different example sentences of these words, and you can scroll down and see different forum discussions where different people have discussed these words and how they're used in the language. And so that's another tool called wordreference.com that you can use to find meanings of words, examples of them, and of course add them to your flashcard lists for this class. So there they're talking about how these are very strong influences from indigenous cultures, Spain, France, Africa, Portugal, throughout Latin America. The next part says, la riqueza cultural viene de muchas partes. So here it says the rich culture comes from many different places, and you can add many of these different words like viene de, or comes from, to your vocabulary list if they're new for you. But here it then gives us a bulleted list of where the culture of Latin America comes from. This sentence starts out with las culturas antiguas como las aztecas, mayas, y incas. So here they're talking about the Aztecs, the Mayans, and the Incas, the indigenous people that have had much influence on countries like Guatemala, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, Honduras, and Mexico. So there you can see that they had a lot of influence on these countries. There's another phrase you could add to your list, tienen mucha influencia, or had much influence on the countries. The next one talks about la historia de colonización por España. España is Spain, and there they're talking about the colonization of Spain, France, and Portugal, and how that made a mark on the literature, the painting, and the music in different countries. The third paragraph talks about la influencia africana, or the African influences in different countries like Brazil, Cuba, Colombia, and many of these here listed. And they talk about the cultural identity called Afro-Latinidad, or Afro-Latinicity, in this particular paragraph. And so for many language learners, perhaps this paragraph is a little bit tricky. There might be some more advanced words here. So what you can do is actually copy and paste that paragraph. So you take that paragraph and copy it, and you can use a tool like ChatGPT, where you can ask it to be your Spanish tutor and then ask it to translate the paragraph to English. Now, I only recommend doing this with some smaller paragraphs or things that you don't really understand. I don't recommend doing this with all of the text of this class. Try not to just rely on translation, but sometimes with really tricky paragraphs or sentences, you might find ChatGPT very helpful for that. And so ChatGPT can then translate that paragraph, and here you can see that translation. The African influence is strong in countries like these countries listed here. due to the arrival of African slaves. And so that might have been one of the more difficult lines to understand, though, in Spanish, debido a la llegada de esclavos africanos. And you can see how that matches up. Debido a la llegada de, or due to the arrival of. That can be a tricky phrase. Sometimes the translation there using a tool like ChatGPT can help you. Understand a little bit more about that important paragraph and the cultural identity of Afro-Latinidad in Spanish-speaking countries and in Latin America. So that's also something you can add then to your study list in Quizlet, where you can have a list of different vocabulary words that you found from the reading. And so then we continue reading the next bullet point, talking more about many of the cultural influences. Las personas de Italia, Alemania y Europa migraron y cambiaron la cultura de Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, Chile y Venezuela, talking about migration from European countries like Italy and Germany that changed the culture in Latin American countries. And so there you can see, you can go forward with translating some of the words that you might not know, or perhaps you can kind of understand the main idea of that bullet point without much translation. The final bullet point says también. También means also. La llegada de chinos, coreanos y japoneses influyó en la cultura de Brasil, Cuba, Guatemala, Panamá, Perú y República Dominicana. So there they talked about Chinese, Korean, and Japanese influences and migration to different countries in Latin America, another part of the rich cultural makeup of Latin America. Throughout that, you then come to the conclusion. La mezcla, or the mixture of all the influences, have created a rich culture in America Latina, often sometimes called cultura indígena afro-latino-americana. And the culture in this region is unique and full of traditions, art, and forms of expression, is the translation there for you. And that can help us understand many of the different words, help us kind of go with a guided reading and use different tools and strategies for understanding the text. What I would do next is go to your own Quizlet cards. Here you can see this list that I've made, really common things like I, pronounced I, means there are. Como was very common in the text, that means like or as. Viene de, tienen mucha influencia. País means country. Fue muy importante, fuerte. Afro-Latinidad, a veces, and so on. After you have a list of your words, then you can click Create, and that will create a flashcard set for you where you can then use this to study, to help you remember these different words and phrases. I encourage you to use different phrases to help you remember different context for these words, and try not to just memorize them for the sake of memorizing them, but remember where you learned them from and in what context they were used in the readings and how they might be used in your own life, moving forward with your Spanish studying. So try to bring some meaning to the words beyond the texts. And there you have it, some different ways of understanding a text in Spanish. I encourage you to go out and do some of your own reading in Spanish using some of these strategies and your ways of figuring out what these different texts mean.